The mist in Rockton did not merely settle, it arrived with the heavy, rhythmic gait of a tired giant. It rolled over the crest of the Allegheny Plateau, spilling into the hollows of Clearfield County and swallowing the hemlock trees until only their jagged tops remained, like the masts of sunken ships. Elias Thorne stood on the porch of his grandfather's cabin, a structure of rotting cedar that seemed to be losing its battle with the damp earth. He held a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold, his eyes fixed on the line where the forest began. He had come back to Rockton to bury a man he barely knew and to sell a property that no one wanted. The local real estate agent had been blunt. Land in this part of Pennsylvania was a hard sell when it was haunted by more than just memories. Elias didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in the silence. It was a thick, suffocating thing that sat on the chest and made the ears ring. A sound broke the stillness. It wasn't the sharp crack of a dry branch or the rustle of a deer. It was a low, rhythmic sob. It sounded human, yet lacked the articulation of a person. It was a liquid sound, wet and desperate, echoing from the ravine where the hemlocks grew densest. Elias stepped off the porch, his boots sinking into the saturated moss. He moved toward the tree line, driven by a curiosity he hadn't felt in years. He was a man of facts, a surveyor by trade, accustomed to measuring the world in degrees and chains. But Rockton had a way of blurring the lines. As he descended the slope, the air grew colder, smelling of rot and ancient water. "Is someone there?" Elias called out. The sobbing stopped abruptly. A heavy silence rushed back in, more alarming than the noise. Elias paused, his hand gripping the rough bark of a sapling. He scanned the undergrowth. The shadows here were layered, shades of charcoal and deep indigo shifting in the dying light. He pushed aside a curtain of dripping ferns. There, huddled beneath the exposed roots of an overturned pine, was a shape. It was roughly the size of a large dog, but its proportions were all wrong. Its skin hung in loose, saggy folds, looking like wet, misaligned leather that had been stretched over a frame of mismatched bones. It was covered in warts and blemishes, a creature of pure, unadulterated ugliness. The creature didn't snarl. It didn't lung. It simply looked at Elias with large, weeping eyes that were clouded with a milky film of sorrow. "My God," Elias whispered. The creature let out a shuddering breath, a sound that rattled in its chest like stones in a tin can. It began to weep again, the tears flowing so freely they carved channels through the grime on its face. This was the squonk. He remembered the stories his grandfather told, the most miserable creature in the world, a beast so ashamed of its own appearance that it spent its life hiding in the shadows, crying until it dissolved. Elias took a tentative step forward, reaching out a hand. "Don't be afraid," he said, though he was the one whose heart was hammering against his ribs. The squonk recoiled, its loose skin rippling like a disturbed pond. It began to retreat into the dark hollow of the roots, its sobs intensifying into a frantic, gurgling wail. It seemed to be shrinking, the very edges of its body softening and turning translucent. Suddenly, a sharp whistle pierced the air from the ridge above. Elias spun around, his eyes narrowing. A man was standing on the edge of the ravine, silhouetted against the gray sky. He carried a heavy burlap sack and a long, hooked pole. It was Miller, a man Elias had seen in town, a local who looked as though he had been carved out of the same hard, unyielding coal as the earth beneath them. "Get back from it, Thorne!" Miller shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. "That's a rare prize you're pestering." "It's a living thing, Miller," Elias replied, his voice tight. "And it's suffering." "It's a nuisance of nature," Miller said, beginning to scramble down the slick slope. "I've been tracking this one for 3 weeks. There's a collector in Pittsburgh who pays a king's ransom for a live squonk. They want to see if the tears really turn to salt." The squonk let out a high-pitched shriek of terror. Elias looked back at the creature. It was trembling violently now. The ground beneath it was becoming saturated, not with the rain, but with the torrent of its own grief. The creature was literally melting away. "Leave it alone," Elias said, stepping between Miller and the hollow. "Move aside, surveyor," Miller hissed, reaching the bottom of the ravine. He raised the hook pole. "That thing isn't even real." It's a mistake of the woods. It shouldn't exist, and it knows it. Maybe that's why it's crying, Elias said. Because the world is full of people like you. Miller lunged forward, swinging the pole. Elias ducked, the metal hook whistling past his ear. He tackled Miller, the two men crashing into the mud and dead leaves. They wrestled in the gloom, a desperate, clumsy struggle fueled by Miller's greed and Elias's sudden, inexplicable need to protect the most pathetic thing he had ever seen. Miller was stronger, his hands calloused and heavy. He shoved Elias's face into the dirt, pinning him down. "You're a fool, Thorne," Miller spat. "You're just like your grandfather. Always looking for magic in a place that only grows coal and rot." Miller scrambled toward the hollow, his sack open. He reached into the darkness beneath the roots, his hands grasping for the sagging skin of the creature. But as he pulled, his hands came away empty. He lunged again, more frantically this time, his boots splashing in a pool of lukewarm water that had gathered where the squonk had been sitting. "Where is it?" Miller yelled, his voice cracking. "Where did it go?" Elias pushed himself up, wiping the mud from his mouth. He looked at the hollow. There was no creature. There was no monster. There was only a shimmering puddle, slowly soaking into the Pennsylvania soil. A few bubbles rose to the surface and popped, releasing a faint smell of salt and old sadness. Elias walked over to the puddle and knelt. In the center of the water, a single, calcified tear remained. It glowed with a faint, pearlescent light before it too dissolved into the earth. "It's gone, Miller," Elias said softly. "It couldn't handle the sight of you." Miller stood there, his chest heaving, his face contorted in a mask of frustration. He looked at the empty sack in his hands and then at the muddy ground. Without a word, he turned and began the long climb back up the ridge, his figure eventually swallowed by the encroaching mist. Elias remained in the ravine long after the sound of Miller's footsteps had faded. The forest was quiet again, the kind of quiet that felt like a held breath. He looked at the hemlocks, their needles dripping with the slow, rhythmic condensation of the fog. He reached out and touched the wet earth where the squonk had vanished. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the silence. He stayed in Rockton for another month. He didn't sell the cabin. Instead, he began to repair the roof, replacing the rotting cedar with sturdy shingles. He cleared the brush from the ravine, not to expose it, but to give the shadows more room to breathe. Sometimes, in the deep hours of the night when the mist was so thick it pressed against the window panes, he would hear it. A soft, distant sobbing coming from the heart of the hemlock grove. He never went down there with a flashlight. He never tried to find it again. He simply sat on his porch, listening to the liquid grief of the world, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to measure anything. The squonk was still there, hiding in its own skin, waiting for the world to be kind enough to let it stay whole. And Elias, the man who had come to bury his past, found himself becoming the guardian of a sorrow he finally understood. He went inside and closed the door, leaving the woods to their tears. The years in Rockton passed like the slow accumulation of leaf litter. Elias became a fixture of the mountain, a man who spoke little but watched much. The townspeople whispered about him, saying he'd gone mountain mad like his grandfather, but they left him to his solitude. They didn't understand that he wasn't alone. He was a witness to a secret geography, one that didn't appear on any of his old surveyor maps. One winter, the snow fell so heavily that the roads were choked for weeks. The silence in the hollows became absolute, a white, frozen weight. Elias stepped out onto his porch, the air biting at his lungs. He saw movement near the tree line, a pale, shuddering shape against the snow. He didn't move, holding his breath. It was the squonk, or perhaps another of its kind. It looked even more fragile in the cold, its skin translucent like thin ice. It wasn't sobbing now, it was shivering, a sound like dry parchment rubbing together. Elias went into his cabin and returned with a bowl of warm mash and a heavy wool blanket. He walked to the edge of the clearing and laid them on the snow. He didn't try to get close. He knew the rules of this engagement. "It's a hard season," he said, his voice a low rumble in the frozen air. The creature watched him, its large, watery eyes reflecting the gray sky. It didn't melt. It didn't run. It waited until Elias had retreated back to the porch before it shuffled forward on its mismatched limbs. It didn't eat the mash, but it curled its sagging body onto the wool blanket, its heavy sobs starting up again, low and mournful. Elias watched from the window until the sun dipped below the ridge. He realized then that the squonk wasn't just a creature of myth or a freak of nature. It was the physical manifestation of the land's own loneliness. Rockton was a place that had been taken from, the timber cut, the coal mined, the youth departed for cities with brighter lights. The squonk was what was left behind, the distilled essence of everything that felt discarded and unloved. As the spring thaw began, the squonk disappeared back into the deep hemlocks, leaving behind only the damp wool blanket and a faint scent of salt. Elias picked up the blanket, finding it heavier than it should be. It was encrusted with tiny, crystalline grains. He ran his fingers over the salt, a grim smile touching his lips. He took the salt and scattered it in a circle around the cabin. He wasn't sure why, but it felt like a gesture of solidarity. A boundary between the world of men and the world of the weeping. One afternoon, a car he didn't recognize pulled up the long, muddy drive. A young woman stepped out, carrying a clipboard and wearing a sharp, professional coat that looked wildly out of place against the backdrop of the decaying woods. "Mr. Thorne," she asked, her voice bright and artificial. "I'm Sarah from the Historical Society. We heard your grandfather's estate might contain records of the early logging camps. We're looking to preserve the local folklore." Elias leaned against the porch railing. "Folklore is a dangerous thing to preserve, Sarah. It's usually happier when it's left in the dark." "Oh, we just want to document the stories," she said, stepping closer. "Like the one about the weeping beast. The squonk. It's a fascinating piece of regional identity." Elias looked toward the ravine, where the shadows were beginning to stretch. "It's not a piece of identity," Elias said. "It's a living ache. You can't put that in a book." "Well, the public is very interested," she persisted. "There's talk of a documentary. We want to bring some attention back to Rockton. This town is dying, Mr. Thorne. Don't you want to help it?" "This town has been dying for 100 years," Elias replied. "That's why it's beautiful. Leave it be." The woman looked at him with a mixture of pity and annoyance. She scribbled something on her clipboard and turned back to her car. "If you change your mind, here's my card. People deserve to know the truth about their heritage." She drove away, her tires churning the mud into deep, ugly ruts. Elias watched her go. He knew she wouldn't be the last. The world was hungry for monsters, for things it could cage and categorize. They didn't want the squonk, they wanted the spectacle of its misery. That night, the sobbing was louder than usual. It was a chorus now, a discordant symphony of grief echoing through the Rockton woods. Elias walked down into the hollow, his boots clicking against the stones of the dry creek bed. He found them in the deepest part of the grove. There were 3 of them, huddled together in a mass of sagging, warty skin. They were weeping in unison, a sound so profound it seemed to vibrate in Elias's very marrow. He sat down on a fallen log, a few yards away. "I know," he said softly. "I know." He sat with them until the moon was high, a silver coin tossed into a dark well. He didn't try to touch them or study them. He simply offered his presence, a man who had also spent much of his life wanting to dissolve. One of the creatures, the smallest of the 3, crawled toward him. It moved with a slow, agonizing grace. It reached Elias's boot and rested its heavy, wet head against the leather. Elias felt a sudden, sharp warmth in his chest. He reached down and, for the first time, touched the skin of the squonk. It was softer than he imagined, like velvet soaked in warm water. It didn't pull away. It let out a long, shuddering sigh and closed its eyes. Elias stayed still, the cold mountain air swirling around them. In that moment, the surveyor understood that some things cannot be measured. They can only be felt. The squonk wasn't an anomaly to be solved, it was a companion in the long, dark night of the soul. As the years rolled on, Elias Thorne's cabin became a landmark of sorts, though few dared to approach it. The forest grew thick and impenetrable around it, a wall of hemlock and laurel that seemed to pulse with a hidden life. The sobbing in the woods became a part of the local atmosphere, like the sound of the wind or the rushing of the creek. Elias grew old, his own skin beginning to sag and wrinkle, his eyes clouding with the same milky film he had seen in the creatures. He walked with a limp, his bones aching with the dampness of the plateau. But he was never truly lonely. He moved through the woods like a ghost among ghosts. On the night Elias Thorne died, the fog in Rockton was thicker than anyone could remember. It was a white wall that cancelled out the stars and silenced the owls. The neighbors who lived miles away said they heard a sound that night, not a sob, but a long, melodic hum that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. When the town constable finally made it up the drive to check on him, he found the cabin empty. The door was standing wide open, and a dusting of salt lay across the threshold. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of Elias at all. The constable walked down to the ravine, his flashlight cutting through the mist. He found a pool of water at the bottom of the hollow. It was perfectly clear, reflecting the gray morning sky. In the center of the pool, resting on a bed of moss, were Elias's old surveyor's tools, the brass compass, the steel tape, and the heavy leather case. The constable knelt at the edge of the pool, his knees soaking through his uniform trousers. "Well, Elias," he whispered. "You always did say you would find a way to leave this place." He reached into the water to retrieve the compass. The liquid was surprisingly warm, a sharp contrast to the biting mountain air. As his fingers brushed the surface, the water rippled, and for a fleeting second, the constable did not see his own reflection. He saw a face he almost recognized, not the withered, weary man Elias had become, but something smoother, more translucent, and entirely at peace. He pulled his hand back, the water dripping from his skin in heavy, crystalline beads. There were no tracks leading away from the hollow. No broken branches, no disturbed earth. Just the pool and the silence that followed a long-awaited release. The constable gathered the tools, his movements slow and respectful. He felt like an intruder in a cathedral built of hemlock and grief. He climbed back up the ridge, stopping once to look over his shoulder at the grove. The fog began to lift, shredded by the rising sun. In the distance, the sound of the creek seemed to change its tune. It was not a sob anymore. It was a soft, rhythmic washing, the sound of a debt finally paid in full. Years later, the woman with the clipboard returned to Rockton. She had her documentary crew and her high-definition cameras, ready to capture the misery of the woods. She pushed through the overgrown trail to find the Thorne cabin, her eyes bright with the prospect of a story she could sell to the highest bidder. "It should be right here," she said, gesturing to a digital map on her tablet. She stepped into the clearing, her designer boots clicking on the dry stones, the epicenter of the sightings. The man who lived here was supposed to be the last witness. But the cabin was gone. In its place stood a circle of white pines, their needles soft and thick on the ground. There was no rot, no ruin, only a vibrant, green stillness that seemed to repel the intrusion of their equipment. "I don't understand," her cameraman said, wiping sweat from his brow. "There is nothing here. Just trees and a puddle." The woman walked to the center of the grove and looked down into a small, clear pool. She saw her reflection, but it was distorted, softened by the shimmer of the water. She reached down to touch it, expecting the cold bite of a mountain spring. Instead, her hand met a warmth that felt like a human palm pressed against her own. "Is it there?" the cameraman asked, adjusting his lens. "Do you see anything we can use?" The woman stood up, her hand wet and trembling. "No," she said, her voice uncharacteristically quiet. "There is nothing here for us." She turned away, leaving the grove to its secrets. Behind her, the pines swayed in a wind that no one else could feel, and from the deep shadows of the ravine, a single, melodic note drifted upward, a sound of joy that had finally found its way out of the tears. The woods closed in behind them, a wall of living green that refused to be measured or categorized. The woman led her crew back toward the gravel road, her pace hurried, as if the very air of Rockton was beginning to weigh upon her lungs. She did not look back at the circle of pines, but the cameraman lingered for a moment, his thumb hovering over the record button. He squinted through the viewfinder, trying to find the source of a sudden, golden light that seemed to pulse from the center of the clearing. "Wait a second," he muttered, his boots crunched on the needles as he pivoted. "The light is shifting. I think I can get a shot of the pool if the sun hits it right." "Leave it, Marcus," the woman called out. Her voice was sharp, cracking with a fear she couldn't name. "We are over schedule. There is nothing but shadows and old stories in this hole." Marcus ignored her, drawn toward the water. He knelt where the constable had knelt decades before, his camera lens mere inches from the surface. He expected to see the moss or the silt at the bottom, but the water had become a lens of its own. It did not show the mud. It showed a vast, starlit expanse that stretched infinitely downward. He saw the brass compass, not sitting on the bottom, but floating in a void of celestial blue, its needle spinning wildly until it settled on a direction that did not exist on any map. "It is not a puddle," Marcus whispered, his breath fogged the glass of his equipment. "It is a doorway." As he spoke, the melodic hum rose again, vibrating through his very marrow. It was no longer a distant echo. It was a chorus of 1,000 voices, all singing the same silver note. The water rose up to meet him, not in a splash, but in a slow, graceful arch that defied gravity. It touched the tip of his camera lens and the electronics flickered, died, and then dissolved into fine white salt. Marcus fell back, scrambling away from the edge on his hands and knees. "What happened?" the woman demanded. She was standing at the edge of the grove, her face pale. "Marcus, get up. We are leaving right now." He didn't tell her what he had seen. He couldn't. He looked at his hands, which were coated in the same warm, crystalline beads that had once clung to the constable. He felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of insignificance, but it was not a cruel feeling. It was the relief of a man realizing he no longer had to carry the world. They reached the van and slammed the doors, the engine roaring to life against the unnatural silence. As the vehicle sped down the winding mountain path, the trees seemed to lean in, erasing the road behind them. By the time they reached the main highway, the GPS on the dashboard blinked and went dark. The woman checked her tablet, only to find the digital map of the Thorn property had been replaced by a blank, white screen. Back in the grove, the pool grew still again. The salt from the camera settled into the moss, nourishing the roots of the white pines. The heavy leather case and the steel tape were gone, pulled deep into the warmth where Elias now walked. There were no more surveyor's marks on the trees. There were no more boundaries to be drawn. A single white bird descended from the canopy, dipping its beak into the water before taking flight toward the peaks. The debt of the land had been paid by the men who stayed, and the men who stayed had finally been set free by the land. Rockton was no longer a place of ghosts or grievances. It was a sanctuary of the unmeasured. The fog rolled back in, soft and protective, sealing the hollow away from the world of clipboards and cameras. The hum faded into a sigh of wind through the needles. Elias was not dead, and he was not lost. He was simply where the compass pointed. He was home.